Stern?
So thank you so much for that question. Just to start, I do want to thank you, Dr. Chatelain, for hosting this book launch. And there's a few people I want to make sure that I am thanking for all their support throughout the years. That includes, my parents, my mother and father, Ernest and Flory J. Walker, for all of their support. My thesis advisor, Dr. Richard J. Powell, and his wife, C.T. Woods Powell. Alex Tyson, who has been with me and designed a really cool website and has supported my work. Christina Medlock and everybody, all of my colleagues, my boss, Bethany Usher at George Mason, everybody at Mason who supported me throughout this book. My fantastic editor, Jordan Beltran Gonzalez, who is part of the reason why this book is finally here. He's been with me through a lot of ups and downs in this process, and I'm really grateful for that. All of my extended family and friends, the Berger side, the Walker side, everyone who's joined us today, and the Bloomsbury staff, the Bloomsbury editors, April, Margaret, all of the entire group has been really helpful. So, and that doesn't count my husband and my sons, who have also been extremely accommodating and supportive of this entire process. That being said, I've been working on this project since 1999, and that's the first time that I came into contact with Irma Stern. I was at the beginning of my graduate school career, and I saw an auction catalog with Irma Stern's paintings. And, I thought she seemed really interesting. I was captivated by her paintings of Black women. And so I decided to write a seminar paper about Irma Stern, thinking that that was going to be it. And I was going to move on to something related to French-speaking West Africa. But there were too many unanswered questions with Irma Stern. She was too interesting, too controversial for me to just leave her alone. And it just so happened accidentally that Duke University had a couple of very rare publications about Irma Stern that no other universities in the United States had. So that allowed me to really dive deeply into her work very early on, and that prepared me for all of my work overseas and preparing the manuscript. So I've been studying Irma Stern for the last 22 years, and I'm really eager to bring Irma Stern to a much broader audience besides just myself and the people in South Africa and Germany who know her well, because I think that she is an instructive case for a lot of things that we're talking about in the public realm today.
One of the issues you confront in writing this book, in many ways, it's a biography, which I always say that I wish I was talented enough as a historian to write a biography, because it's so hard, because there's a lot of picking and choosing what needs to be talked about, what needs to be amplified. But it's also a story about the art world and the ways that people establish authority and the ways that there's gatekeeping and privilege. And so can you tell us a little bit about Stern's origins and how she is evolving as an artist during critical conversations about the nature of art?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Irma Stern, just by the dates that she was born in 1894 and she died in 1966, she lived through all of the most consequential social, cultural, historical, political movements of the 20th century. And so much of her life, all the important parts of her life are shaped by these critical moments. And that was a challenge in writing the book, because I needed to narrow the focus, but it was difficult to choose what to leave out, because it seemed like every time she had a big moment in her life, there was also a big historical moment. One example is when she was a young child, when she was just a few years old, the Boer War broke out in South Africa, and her family became refugees and they relocated to Cape Town. And the reason why they went to Berlin the first time was because of an outbreak of the plague. So they were fleeing a public health situation, and they went to Germany. So I felt like that really shaped her understanding later on of migrations and how people need to be more transient in general. And so I didn't want to leave that out. But you know, with when somebody lived for 71 years and painted for pretty much their whole life, you have to make some decisions about what you're going to leave in and what you're not going to leave in. So that was a real challenge from moving this. You know, this was ultimately, it started out as my dissertation, and when I was turning it into a manuscript, I had to think about what were the most important things about her life for a more general reading audience. And the transition into the book really made me focus on those 20th century years where she has become an established artist and really starts to come across some of the gender discrimination as a woman in South Africa, as a Jewish woman, and how the Jewish community in particular supported Stern and helped her navigate those obstacles as a young woman, and then how she, in turn, once she became famous, used that fame in ways that were morally questionable. So how she used that to then become more famous. She didn't have privilege, and then all of a sudden she did. And instead of using her privilege to help bring out injustice and challenge authority, she became somebody who had authority, and then didn't really do a good job of opening doors for others. So I decided that was really the more interesting question about Stern for a general audience.
Well, one of the things that you write early in the book, you said, for example, Stern not only openly supported a color line that segregated people by race, but also regularly crossed this line herself to paint women in Black and colored areas. Her hauntingly beautiful paintings of Black South African women in particular reveal a woman whose artistic vision transcended the rigid social and political structures of the era, even when her personal views did not. And so, is there a way that in the analysis of her art that previous to your intervention, how did people understand her? Were assumptions made about who she was politically during the era of apartheid because of her subject matter?
Yeah, so this was the one of the biggest controversies of studying Stern, and this is why I use the term racial paradox when talking about Stern, because she had the most access to different types of South Africans of anyone. She traveled to areas of the Eastern Cape and the East Coast and the Natal region, and she lived with Black Africans. And she oftentimes wrote about how these were some of the only places where she was accepted. She was very concerned about her personal appearance. She felt that she was overweight, that her hair was too frizzy, and that she was being judged by this. And when she went to those Black areas, she was accepted pre-apartheid. She was accepted. People didn't judge her for those reasons. And so she felt very comfortable, and you can see that, I think, in the paintings, that she feels accepted. But as time went on, and as she became more a part of the establishment, she started to accept establishment views, including an embrace of what was referred to as the color line. And so she ran into personal trouble because she was also very much supported by the Jewish community. She had friends who wrote for the newspapers, who were active in radical politics, and they were constantly challenging her views. And so a lot of people did assume that she shared those views, and she was often very careful to say that she did not share the views of more left-leaning members of the Jewish community. And that was to protect her financial interest in receiving support from the government. So, she's oftentimes referred to in the scholarship as being, quote unquote, apolitical. And I see that as something that is also a way to pigeonhole her and her gender, and not to give her the kind of agency that she had. She was more aware of the evolving situation of Black South Africans than most white South Africans were. And she made a choice. She had a choice and she made one. She decided that it was important for her to be known throughout the world. It was important for her to be able to travel and be supported by the government in that way. It was important for her to become one of the most famous modern South African artists. And the price for that was that she had to go against what her friends in the community were saying, that there was gross injustices committed against the majority of the population. So she really, despite an obvious affinity for Black people and Black culture, really went against what she saw personally in those people-to-people interactions and that acceptance of her in order to become known and to be present in the history as the most famous modern South African artist.
One of the things I was really struck by early in the book, when you talk about the role that the cosmopolitan nature of Berlin and its global context, not only for Irma Stern, but for Black thinkers. Like you talk about Alain Locke, you think about through the New Negro movement, and in many ways, it's this really. This book is so beautifully written because you can feel the tension of the moment, and so it starts with an art heist, and there are all these moments where I think you do such a wonderful job of setting the scene, and as the reader you want to jump in and tell and warn everyone what's coming around the corner. But there's this moment, you see Germany in transition as well, and the rise of the Nazi regime and the kind of the tightening of the anti-Semitism, and how, on one hand, Germany is being praised for its intervention in the art world. At the very moment, it's really closing its own it's literally closing its society to others. And so can you talk about why it was important for you to kind of not only relate the anti-Semite state to Stern, but also to think about how it impacts the New Negro movement and Black thinkers at the time?
Yeah, so this was one of the most fascinating finds of my research that came pretty early on, as a result of my brilliant dissertation advisor saying, within 10 minutes of me talking about Irma Stern, he said, I think she was mentioned in the New Negro. And he pulls up the New Negro off of his shelf. He looks at it, and sure enough, there's a reference to Irma Stern in there, except that her name is spelled wrong. And this happens throughout the archive. She's Elaine, she's Alana, she's Irma, but her name is mentioned next to Max Pechstein, who was her mentor. And we also see this a lot in art history scholarship when a woman artist has been mentored by a male artist, her identity gets subsumed under his. And so I think that is what happened in this situation, but it's clearly that Alain Locke is referring to Irma Stern. And that's really when the spark for this project caught fire, and I realized that there was something more to this than just a South African artist who had gone to Berlin and come back, from the Weimar period. So I actually didn't expect, I got a fellowship to go to Berlin. I didn't expect to receive the fellowship. And I was in this position where found out I was moving to Germany, and I had like 3 months notice to do it. And I really believe that everything that has happened over the last 20 years for this project has happened for a reason. So as you know, I'm an international educator, and I deeply believe in the power of international exchange, and particularly for people of color to be in these other environments and to have those experiences of not being seen as Black American in the American context. And so when I got to Germany, I really became immersed in the thought of Alain Locke, Audre Lorde, Angela Davis, W.E.B. Du Bois, and I really got a sense of what it was like for them to feel liberated from the confines of the way we talk about race in the United States, but also to be in this culture where you can sense the anti-Semitism. I mean, to me, it feels like it's in the air in a lot of ways, even now. And so how do you negotiate feeling like this is a place that's better for you, as a Black person, but knowing that horrible things were perpetrated against Jewish people in the same area. So, that was the backdrop of me doing the research there. But I see how important Weimar Berlin was, in the early 20th century in shaping Black thought, and why Irma Stern really fit well in that context. Many of the German expressionists were very interested in Africa and in the Asian Pacific Islands, in exotic places. And so Irma Stern was a young woman who was African. She was South African. She was born in South Africa, and that's how she saw herself. And not only was she South African, but she had, as she put forth the narrative, grown up around Black people. And so that in itself was really interesting to people around her in Berlin. And she was painting images of Black women because she had actually seen them before. Whereas her male counterparts were going to ethnographic museums and painting based on African sculptures. So she really fit in well in this environment, and I can see why scholars like Alain Locke, who were looking for something different, they were looking to inspire a new generation of African American artists in the modern context, looking for them to think about what does a racial aesthetic look like? How can it be liberating? If you look at many of Irma Stern's paintings, and when I teach her in my classes, students will routinely think that those paintings are painted by a Black artist. So it's really hard for people to piece together that, not only was she not Black, but she really believed in the color line. So I can see how Locke coming in the 20s would see someone's work like that and say, yes, this is the direction that we need to be going in, away from caricature, away from stereotypes, and towards a more humane and humanity-based rendition of the Black aesthetic. So the time and the timing of how all those pieces fit together for all of those people to have come through Berlin, that it was a crossroads, even more so than Paris. I think people might say that particular time, if you're thinking about racial ideas, it really was a crucible for that kind of discussion. And so, Stern was very astute in deciding to study art in Berlin at that time. And as you can imagine, and is in the book, when she brought these ideas back to Cape Town as a young person, Cape Town didn't know what had hit it, because these ideas that was not the way people talked about race, and it was not the way people talked about art in Cape Town at the time.
Well, one of the things that you write, you said that critics expressed their most profound distaste for Stern's paintings of Black people, viewing the term modern as being synonymous with her paintings of Native types. And so, but this is not how she is understood as an artist for the duration of her career. There is this interesting transition you capture, not only in her exhibition at Ashby's Art Gallery, but you also talk about her travel writing, which I think is also really fascinating. So can you tell us a little bit about kind of the progression of her from this artist who's kind of doing something that people don't know what to make of, to someone who's writing about other parts of Africa, to a beloved artist in South Africa?
Yeah, I can really credit her interactions and support from the Jewish community for making that move. They really both challenged Stern's ideas and thoughts, but also gave her the appropriate attention in the right places at the right times to put her in the realm of public debate. And I think that there was a lot of foresight amongst her friends who were very progressive, not as well traveled as Stern, but understood that there was a bigger world that was discussing these ideas. And so they're the ones who I think really challenged and pushed her. One of the biggest debates going on in the Jewish community at the time about art was what constituted Jewish art in South Africa. Was that art that depicted Jewish subjects? So, biblical scenes or scenes of lifestyle transitions in Jewish culture? Or was it that Jewish artists tackled issues of the day and challenged issues of the day through their work? And that was a big point of contention. And some people argued that Stern was doing that in her paintings, just by nature of the fact of painting Black women as subjects and not as native types, not as scientific study or not as figures in some landscape, that was so groundbreaking. Um, to us today, that doesn't seem very progressive or new, but it was earth shattering at the time, because Black people were seen as not even human in South Africa. And so the idea that you would give somebody some type of emotional life and depth through painting was crazy. And so the Ashby's exhibition that Stern did in 1922 had all kinds of, she had all kinds of paintings. She did some paintings of animals, of flora and fauna, but lots of paintings of Black women. And in a prophetic way, that exhibition was shut down. People said it was too progressive, that it was too controversial. And as soon as it was shut down, the line stretched around the block for it. And fast forward less than 20 years, and the Degenerate Art exhibition was doing the same thing. So Stern was very much ahead of the curve in so many ways, and also behind the curve in other ways, which again speaks to that racial paradox. So once she became famous, she started making more money. She divorced her husband as soon as she could be self-sufficient financially. She had only married so she could get out of the house, and she hit the road. So between taking a boat back and forth between South Africa and Europe, which was no easy task, she didn't let World War II stop her either. So once she realized that she could no longer travel to Europe because of the war, she then began traveling within the African continent. And she rented a car. She had a driver for some things, but not always. And she drove from South Africa to Central Africa, which is a very long distance. And at that time, there were very few paved roads. And for a woman artist of any background to do that was just also very, very unusual. But for her, she packed up her luggage. She brought all kinds of gifts, and she again embedded herself in these communities. So she's back in this routine that she started when she was a teenager, of going out to these places where she's accepted, but also where she can make all kinds of observations and meet people. So in the middle of her trip to the Congo, where she wrote a travel narrative called Congo. She actually foreshadowed the 1994 genocide, because she made observations about Hutus and Tutsis and about the extreme cultural divide. And she pointed out some of the physical differences between those two groups and how that was a point of tension. And if you read the Congo narrative, you can actually see that there's going to be ethnic conflict based on what she's observing. She had no idea at the time that was going to happen, but it's just extraordinary to me that a woman, a single woman, could do all of that and use art to do it. So she really just embodies this figure. Alex Tyson coined the term 20th century millennial, because of the way that she just really used all of the technology and the capabilities to be in these places and explore. And throughout her travels and her exploration, this grappling with race is at the center of all of it.
One of the things that this book also talks about is power in the art world, and the way that race can sometimes cohere to power or an expectation of what art should look like. And one of the things that you say is, while Black artists are trying to define themselves away from this kind of native idea, white artists are celebrated for putting this a refinement on this ideal, while Black artists have to kind of decide what their proximity to it is. And one of the things that I really found fascinating is when you talk about the way that she is, she again is doing this, she's featuring Black women in this way that is different, but on the other hand, you say kind of resists um, the understanding of Black women as part of the modern development of Cape Town. You say it's like this kind of celebration of a pre-industrial subject that is both defiant but never fully kind of immersed in the developments that are happening. And so from your perspective, if you were to think about, you know, what is happening with Black artists in South Africa as well as globally while she's emerging, where are some of the kind of places where you see this power dynamic illustrated?
Yeah. So one kind of interesting thing about Stern is that she very rarely painted city scenes. So much of what you see are either portraits. There's no background, or it's a rural setting. And as a matter of fact, I chose the cover for that very reason, because she almost never painted anybody in a domestic sphere like that. And I'm saying all this because that's a really important part of how Stern understood Blackness, was that it was rural, that it was agrarian, and that Black people were frozen in time. So she became very disturbed in the 30s, 40s, and 50s as there were movements, resistance movements that were growing. And it really bothered her that Black people wanted more than what they had, which wasn't very much in their own land. And so she then, in response to that, after the war, she spent more time in Europe, because every time she would go out to the countryside, people would express their anger about their situation. And the situation was getting worse and worse and worse. So, Stern, it just shattered what her view was of what Blackness was and what Black people were. Now, to compare that to someone like Gerard Sokoto, for example, who is a Black South African artist who's a little bit was younger than Stern. He lived in Sophiatown, and he did tons and tons of watercolors and drawings and paintings of Black life in the townships. And that gives you a very, very big window into what apartheid was doing to the Black community. Now, Sokoto also, I don't want to make it sound like he was painting images of people just always looking depressed and downtrodden. He paints joyous scenes of Black life, but he's very realistic about the effects of apartheid on Black people. He had to go into exile. So he had to leave South Africa because of what he was doing and because of who he was. And he went to Paris in exile. So you have two artists who both claim to be modern artists, who both are modern artists, who are interested in Black people as artistic subjects, but are taking very different things about South Africa and its current state from them. So if you look at Irma Stern, Black people never came into the cities at all. They all lived in the rural areas. Whereas Sokoto is giving you a much more direct look into what Black life is like. So as you can see, Sokoto's work was valued outside of South Africa, but he didn't achieve fame until later in life. At the same time, Irma Stern's work was being purchased for embassies, South African embassies. She was winning national competitions and was in fact encouraged to apply for those competitions. In my readings of the archives, I can see where she has people are writing her letters and basically saying, if you apply for this art competition, you're going to win it. So she's getting all this government support to put forward this narrative that Black people are agrarian. And, she's not depicting the urban settings that's going on. The government was very interested in how they were going to put forward this view that Black people were okay with and happy with what was happening as apartheid was being developed. And Stern fit into that very well. They could say, look, here's a Jewish woman who is South African, who paints images of Black people and colored South Africans and Jewish South Africans and paints the diversity of this country. We're a happy country. Everything's fine here. There's nothing to see. And someone like Sokoto doesn't show that view. So she really benefited. This is really a case where, when she first came and she was known as a Jewish person in a Jewish community, she was initially rejected. But as white South Africans began to embrace Jewish people as white, she gained a lot of those privileges and used them to be part of this narrative.
And so I want to just ask you two more questions before I open it up to the audience. And so, as the agitation against apartheid is growing stronger, and as you see this kind of incredible Pan-African movement that's emerging, you see connections with the civil rights struggle in the US, you see the struggles in throughout Asia. She takes a turn in her painting that I think I'm very curious to hear from you. Why do you think she takes that turn? Do I need to tell the audience what the turn is and what you make of it?
So she does a couple of things. One, she starts going to Europe and painting what I think are very boring scenes of people picking, grapes and pimentos and other things in Europe. And then, but she also does, she does a painting in 1955 called Made in Uniform, which is the painting that's on the cover of the book. And she does a couple of paintings of Xhosa women in the Eastern Cape. And at one point she goes out there and she says, I don't think I can go out there anymore. People are very riled up about independence and colonialism, and I'm not accepted anymore. And so I'm really not going to be able to continue painting. So we're left with Made in Uniform, which she didn't say very much about, but to me is clearly a statement of disgust with one's political and social situation. And then some paintings that look as close to native types as you could possibly get. And at the same time, she wrote letters a lot. So there's just a voluminous letter correspondence. And actually Sandra Klopper, who's a South African art historian, just did a really beautiful book of all the letters between Stern and her friends, Richard and Frida Feldman. And at one point, her friend Richard was very radical, Yiddish-speaking writer who wrote about the deplorable conditions that Black people were living in. And they were talking about the independence movement in Kenya. And Stern says, I cannot believe that this is happening. I'm afraid of what's going to happen to South Africa. She alludes to Black people and their resistance as being savage or savagery. So she really feels threatened, but at the same time, her career is taking off. So she reconnects with her gallery dealer back in Europe. She's in the Venice Biennale. She's in the Sao Paulo Biennale. She is exhibiting all over the place. So, I think she was trying to cement a legacy of sorts, but at the same time, understand that her country was changing far too rapidly for her to comprehend. And I'll say at this point that Stern was a very, very quirky and interesting young woman. I never met her. She died in 1966 before I was born. But she was known for extravagant parties. She had lots of food that she cooked from all over the world. And unfortunately, she had diabetes that was uncontrolled. And so she became morbidly obese and could not control her diabetes. So another thing that I think could have been happening as well was she became extremely ill at the end of her life and wasn't, taking insulin. So I think that, that also impacted the way, her responses to some of these things that are happening, because they're very visceral, and she's really rejecting all that she's seeing in her face, that she's been able to interact with her travels.
I think that's so interesting. It reminds me a little bit of Fannie Hurst, who wrote Imitation of Life, and all of these books about food and dieting, and a lot of projection on Black women. And that's where we get the Mammy character in The Imitation of Life, right? This kind of servile person who has these weird relationships to her white employers. And so I'm going to ask the last question, and then folks continue to enter your questions in the Q&A. The last chapter of this book is so perfect because it doesn't end with, and then Irma Stern died and her paintings are worth a lot of money. It's an evaluation from a new generation of South African artists, many of them born after apartheid, weighing in on the kind of cultural legacy and this question of where she should fit within the kind of national narrative of South African art and culture. And I think a lot of people in a really facile way always, point to South Africa's ability to move on from apartheid. And that's a huge asterisk on that one. And, they say, well, the changing of cultural symbols, but I think that you not only make a point that that wasn't the entire kind of approach, but Irma Stern still looms large, even in light of all of this. And so what was that like, kind of concluding on that note?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because it was a real struggle to figure out how to end this book. I'm a Black American art historian. I got a lot of flack and criticism from everywhere about why was I writing about a white South African artist when there are so many Black South African artists over the years who have been overlooked. Very legitimate question. However, as I mentioned at the beginning, I started researching this topic in 1999. Apartheid was not even ended for 5 years by that point. And so, there had been a cultural boycott, and there had been very little scholarly exchange with South Africa. It was very difficult to access materials. And so, I had to, if I wanted to do anything, this was my entree into this area. And so I've been self-conscious about being a Black American scholar in the South African space, because I agree, we've spent way too much time talking about Irma Stern in a South African context. This is why her paintings sell for in the millions of dollars. There's so many books written about her already. I'm the first Black person to write a full-length study of Irma Stern, but I wanted to do something different. I wanted to challenge the notion that she was apolitical, or that her paintings could be received in an apolitical way. And most importantly, I wanted to figure out how to give a voice to this new generation in this new country. And it just so happened that I was teaching a class in South Africa called Monuments, Museums, and Memory in South Africa. And we were looking at the question of public monuments and how they contribute to white supremacist narratives. And so I was already in South Africa in 2018 teaching this class. And every year there's a special art show called the Turbine Art Fair. And when this art fair takes place, they select a group of Black artists to study an older South African artist, and of course they're mostly going to be white. And they create works in response to their work. It just so happened that year was the year that they had chosen Irma Stern. So I was able to connect to those artists and interview them and talk with them, and just being able to learn from them. I'm an academic and a teacher, and I'm just always inspired and refreshed by young people. And so that was a privilege to be able to talk with them, but also to hear their reactions to Irma Stern. They didn't all universally say that they hated her. Actually, I don't know if any of them really said that. They really connected to her artistically. Some of them were interested in the colors that she used in her paintings. Others were interested in the textiles that she used. One of the artists, David, was really interested in her personal story and struggle as a woman artist, as a Jewish artist, because he himself had a lot of family and personal struggles that affected his artwork. So he connected with her in that way. And so ultimately, I felt like it was such a great story to tell as the end of this book, because it showed that even though Irma Stern has a lot of issues that are unsavory at best, she has inspired people and touched people's lives across race, class, and gender backgrounds, and that there's still something that we can take from that. And I loved to hear how these artists were thinking about her work, and they spent a lot of time talking with each other and observing her work before they created works of their own. They're young, they have their whole careers ahead of them, and Irma Stern, whether she would have liked it or not, has touched the lives of Black artists. I'll also say that Irma Stern did mentor one or two Black artists when she was alive. So I want to make sure that I'm giving as much of a layer to her as well. And I think that's what just makes her so complicated and so fascinating, was she could say these awful things, but then support and mentor young Black artists. She rescued German Jewish artists from Germany and brought them from the Holocaust. But she also was very good friends with Jan Smuts, who was a white supremacist. So, all of these things are all wrapped up together in this one artist. And as much as I have really appreciated, a lot of the scholarship that has come before me for Stern, I feel like my unique contribution has been to be able to see all of these different pieces that fit together, to see the German side, to see the African American German connection, to look at South Africa as an outsider, to see how all of this fits together right now, to talk to the younger generation about this. All of those things, I feel like have allowed me to make this book something that's different than the many other books and texts about Irma Stern that we have already.
I'm going to take one of Alex Tyson's questions. Hi, Alex. It's good to see you. About and I think someone else had mentioned that in the chat. This is not an artist who has been devalued by any stretch of the imagination. And so, what do you think it is about Stern particularly that has allowed her to resonate in the pre and post-apartheid moment?
So one of the reasons why I think she's still, the prices of her paintings are going higher and higher, is the subject matter. So, she's painting these very beautiful images of Black women. And I believe that, globally, Black women are still exoticized and sexualized in ways that people want to consume those images through paintings, even if they don't have any Black friends or have any interactions with Black women personally, that they want to own these images, that there's ownership involved.
And has there ever been any engagement on who these subjects were?
Can you repeat the question?
Has there ever been any scholarly engagement on who these women were that she was painting?
Yeah, so she didn't keep very good records about who she who they were, and this is one of the issues with how people distinguish what's a portrait versus what is a native study. She didn't record a lot of names. She didn't, use the names in the paintings. Most of the paintings are things like Three Swazi Women or, Zulu Girl. So absolutely, like we have no sense of who they are as individuals. We know them as members of ethnic groups, but not necessarily of individuals. And that's, from her work has primarily been collected by a South African audience, which has been a wealthy audience of people. But now she's getting global attention. And she's a woman artist who's been understudied and overlooked. People want to get in and be seen as ahead of the curve in terms of art collecting. And if you bought a Stern 20 years ago, you probably would make a lot more now than what you paid for it. So I think the attention that she's gotten outside of South Africa has really made her work magnified in terms of its price. But most of the work that comes up for auction, are the still lifes that she did. She did a lot of still lifes, but also these images of Black women throughout the African continent.
And one of the things I think is so interesting how she describes it as this like this relationship of comfort instead of one about deference and power, right? Like how much power does a woman have in the situation to say no, don't paint me, or if you're going to paint me, where I need money for it. And so, what do you think her read of these affective bonds are? Because this is also very classic, like 19th century Reconstruction era fantasies of Black, piety towards white subjects without a conversation about power.
It's interesting that you bring that up because one of the artists that I interviewed for the last chapter of the book said that for her that was a point of curiosity for her. So she would think of Stern in a more favorable way if she somehow knew that the women had been treated kindly and that Stern had made some kind of effort to get consent from them before painting their images. And I think that's also a generational thing that younger people really, really believe in the idea of consent, and 19th and 20th century people, a lot less so. So yeah, I think this was it varied over time. When she went to Central Africa, she packed up her car full of lots of treats, and she put a typewriter in the car, and she drove, and she went to people and said, "I'd like to paint you. Do you need a typewriter? And if I give you a typewriter, can I paint you?" So in those situations, there was some amount of bartering, but I talk about this in chapter 3 in the Congo section. She thought that she was getting, she thought that this was buying her access to the real lifestyles of the Mengbetu and the other people. And so she thought she was really, getting a window into their life when they understood her game as well. So they gave her a very packaged version, a very tourist version of their life. So, she really misjudged their ability to take advantage of situations and to protect, what was important to them as well. So, I think she suffered from a lot of the same kinds of blind spots that white people did at the time, that they just assumed that Black people would be happy to have their images painted, or that they wouldn't care. And so, you see there's a lot of variation over time with how she handles that.
Well, as we round out this incredible discussion, I wanted to just ask you about this journey. Writing a book is so hard, and it brings up so many emotions, but I want to just kind of, ask you, what does it feel like to be on the other side of this project?
It feels really good. Um, it feels like it was definitely much longer than any childbirth. So I am very relieved that it is out, and it is now, an actual object that I can touch. That is not.
Hold it up again.
Yeah, here it is. Here it is. I keep it right next to me at all times. But you know, it is a relief. It's a relief. But what I'll say is that I was so self-conscious for a long time about when it was coming out. As you know, because you've written several books, you know, you're eager to get to that other side. And when I was trying to get the book finished, I felt like, oh, it's not coming out on the 50th anniversary of her death. This is a problem. But now I realize that it came out exactly when it was supposed to come out, even if that took 22 years. We are having the most critical conversations about race, about gender, about the lack of representation of women artists in the artistic canons that we have had ever. And to have the opportunity to speak about someone as complex as Irma Stern in this moment is really exciting to me. And someone gave me some good advice. They said, you know, you write a book, and it's really about the life and the conversations that you have after the book is published. That's important. And I am so happy that this book is out right now, because I want to talk about this stuff all the time with everyone. I believe that it's so important for us to think about not only what happens when people make decisions like Stern made that benefit her and not other people, but also how we judge ourselves and other people. Stern made some bad decisions, but I wouldn't, it's hard to always just demonize people and say that they're all bad. So I think it's really important before we jump to conclusions to judge other people that we think about those internal contradictions that we have in our own lives. And that has been one of the biggest lessons that has come from me writing this book, is really being mindful of those, and having these wonderful conversations with wonderful scholars like you, Dr. Chatelain.
Well, I am so honored to have had the opportunity for this discussion. Everyone go and get a copy of this book. I believe in the chat there's information on ordering it. I don't know if we can see everyone, but if you could unmute yourself and just give a round of applause to our incredible scholar and friend, LaNitra Walker-Berger. Congratulations on the publication of your book.
Thank you so much. I don't know if people can unmute on these settings, but I feel the love. I see everybody's names on the attendee list, and I'm so grateful that you all came out. I'll be talking about this book through the Jewish Book Council for the next year, so you'll probably get tired of me inviting you to things, but I really plan to make the most out of this. And I really want to thank Dr. Chatelain for leading this discussion, for being a model for me as a scholar, for writing her fantastic book, Franchise, which has been critically acclaimed in all of the major publications. So please get her book as well. And, you know, again, I just want to thank you all for coming out today and for listening to this discussion.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.